So why is there just so much profit in poverty? Now, this is a question that has actually come up many times over the past few years, in particular as we have seen an explosion here of just drug addict camps and homeless camps all over our cities and along the freeways in the Pacific Northwest in particular, which is where I live, but also elsewhere in our country. Now, every year, taxpayers are kicking they're just sending out millions of more dollars than they ever did the year before to solve the homeless problem. And yet the money just appears to do nothing to actually solve anything, except perhaps to make things worse. So what exactly is happening here? Now, I want to first tell you real quick, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and feel free to share this video with others who might disagree with me on this subject. I always welcome the feedback, and I usually respond to most of the comments that you leave down below. Now, if you do live in a state or a city where this isn't happening yet, you aren't having these homeless camps everywhere, congratulations. But it's really just a matter of time before you're going to see these exact same situations right where you live as well, just as much as I see them where I live. Now, it isn't exclusively a problem for blue states or cities that are dominated by Democrats or left-leaning crazies. Don't get me wrong, there is a clear political agenda that encourages this situation, but the problem isn't confined there. Now, why? Well, basically because there's just a lot of profit in promoting poverty, just like this, and the taxpayers, and that is the money that's extracted from you, whether you want to waste it or not, we are all on the hook to ensure that the grant grifting cash gravy train, just the whole program, just continues to solve homelessness. That just continues to ensure the problem will only and certainly get worse. Now, how does poverty, particularly extreme poverty, generate just so much profit? And who exactly is profiting? Now, first of all, in order to profit from the situation, you really do need cash. And there are several sources of cash. You can, of course, just ask for donations. You can ring a bell outside of stores at Christmas time or have fancy fundraisers. Now, that's one way to get money. But it actually takes just a lot of time, energy, and especially volunteer time. And this produces, that whole process really also means that just a lot of people are going to be involved in fundraising and to get these funds. And of course, they often start asking questions over time, including very difficult questions like, how exactly is the money spent? And where is it going? Or even worse, why are we raising more and more money, but the problem keeps getting worse? Now, these become awkward and annoying questions to answer, and, well, you can always shift the blame around. Eventually, at some point in time in the future, accountability could become a very annoying issue to address. So, quite some time ago, the people who profit from the poverty of others, they realized that the biggest source of cash was the government, of course. And I mean, nothing else is even remotely close to how much money the government can dump on supposedly to solve problems. Now, if you could get the government to actually fund your effort and your grant grifting operations, then all you need to do is just convince or lobby just a handful of government officials, bureaucrats, and particularly the politicians, to give you the cash that you claim that you need. Now, the best part about getting money basically from government is that nobody's really looking or verifying to see how well you actually spent that money. The politicians, they just want to pretend like they're doing something. They want to hold a press conference and get a positive virtue signaling headline. The bureaucrats, they just want to justify their existence in the first place. And the worse the problem gets, this actually helps them bloat their bureaucracy and budget just a bit more next time around. There's a lot of money in making a problem worse than in actually solving it. You got to remember, pretty much every federal, state, and local government entity that's involved in distributing the grant cash, they get a taste. Call it an administrative bonus if you want, before they kick that cash out onto the street or to the grant grifters. Now, once the grant is issued or the cash dispersed, nobody in government really wants to know what happens to that cash. Was it stolen? Was it wasted, or was it invested poorly? If so, that could actually be a negative headline in the media, and it could actually spark a backlash against the gravy train. So these government bureaucrats, they simply just don't want to know, neither do the politicians. Everyone just wants to pretend that all is well, and next year they have incentive to kick out an even bigger pile of cash so that they can continue to fail to solve the problem that they failed to solve last year, and the year before, and the year before that. Now, unlike private donors, public grants can usually be squandered and nobody's really looking, or even if they pretend to look, they really don't want to expose the problem with how the money was wasted. Now, why is that? It's because everybody would look bad and nobody wants that, so nobody's looking. So where does this mostly government cash go that flows into the homeless industrial complex all over our cities, states, and our nation? Well, mostly it actually goes to pay the costs of the homeless industrial complex itself. I mean, nobody can really confirm how much money actually goes to help solve the problem at the end of the day, but it takes a mountain of cash to keep the problem growing, and these grants act like fertilizer to just ensure that the bigger the grants are today, they're going to need to be even bigger because the problem's only going to grow tomorrow. Now, let me clarify right now before I continue down this ugly rabbit hole. There are a lot of well-intentioned and serious people who volunteer to help people in need. I mean, some have been doing this for years. Some are very new to the challenge. And they volunteer at food banks. They provide addict and maybe mental health counseling, and sometimes other services that actually treat the symptoms and even every now and then the causes, like mental health problems or addiction or alcoholism, things like that. And it's very tough and often thankless work. Now, these volunteers and often very giving people are frequently featured as examples on the literature and promotion materials of the very nonprofits extracting the grant cash. And they are not the problem. People like this, they're not the problem. In fact, these are often the people who are the best sources for discovering the truth about how the resources are wasted and squandered to ensure that the problem is only going to get worse. Now, if you don't believe me, great. Here's how you can actually start to see what's happening where you live. You can start with your city or your county or your state. Just get copies of years of grant contracts. I would say over the last 5 years, for example, it's a good place to start. And then start to see who's actually getting this cash. How much are they getting? What problem did they promise to solve 5 years ago with the grant? And how are the grants growing since that time? I mean, see if there's actually any metrics that they're using to demonstrate any kind of accomplishments. Usually the metrics, when they use them, are just indicative of activity, not about achieving actual solutions. For example, they're going to tell you how they handed out millions of needles to drug addicts, or 40 tons of food, or 5,000 tents, or they served 15,000 homeless people over the past year. Whatever their metric, it's actually rarely one that portrays success, but it's often a number that is crafted to encourage an even bigger grant check next year. Now, lately, the cash flow has actually grown to include Housing First programs that try to sweep the drug addict camps off the highly visible streets and out of sight inside of hotels or tiny homes or apartments where the problem actually just becomes less visible, particularly when election season's right around the corner. This actually has a couple of benefits to the homeless industrial complex. First, it's actually a way, far more expensive way, than just kicking out supplies on the sidewalk, so they can justify even larger grants than they ever did before. Secondly, they can then use a metric that seems like success of sorts. Hey, we managed to get 150 people into permanent transitional housing with wraparound services and something like that. It is very expensive, of course, and everyone gets their cut of cash along the way. In addition, the government buys or leases failing apartment complexes and hotels, particularly those that were not financially viable in the first place. And this actually looks like an asset on the capital budget books, even whenever they actually buy them. Now, of course, the problem is that if they sweep too many homeless junkie camps out of sight and then remove them from the byways, the parks, and the neighborhoods, well, then the problem isn't in the public eye as much, and then people are not clamoring to clean up the problem. So remember, part of the program here is to freak out the local community enough that in desperation they're going to be willing to pay any price to keep the problem, basically to make it go away. And if you are a grant grifter working for the government or working for one of these expensive nonprofits, the more desperate the community is to solve the problem, then the more willing they are going to be to pay actually large, huge dollars to make it go away. At least that's what they hope. So eventually, the homeless problem just grows into a homeless industrial complex. It's kind of in a balancing act where they keep the worst of all worlds perpetuating and then growing the underlying problem and growing the cash flow spigot one big grant at a time. They collect the big cash on the property purchases, the transactions, the maintenance, the asset collection side of things. And they grow just enough encampments with wandering drug addicts, garbage, and escalating crime, growing fast enough to facilitate desperation in the community to just go do something. To fix, of course, the problem, theoretically. Meanwhile, the problem just continues to get worse. Now, there are numerous downsides to the public good with this problem, of course. The obvious decay of the community, the expanding base of drug addicts, basically looking for just cheap highs, free stuff, maybe in a lifestyle that just lets them have easy access to the drug of choice until they kill themselves. Then there's the public who basically loses massive amounts of resources as their tax dollars are just squandered on a bottomless money pit of a problem that only gets worse the more money that they spend. Crime itself, of course, that produces victims every day, and not all of these victims are the homeless that you claim to be trying to help. Visitors, business people, and residents with resources, they wisely begin to vacate the community because of the decay. Now, the downward spiral only accelerates from there. Now, while this destroys the community, there are winners in this game, and this is where the money comes into play. Criminal organizations distributing drugs, fencing stolen goods, promoting prostitution, and promoting other illegal but very profitable activities. They flourish in this environment, and they have every incentive to keep the good times rolling. They're basically, these are really good opportunities for criminals, but they're not good times for their victims or for the people who live in these progressive communities. The bureaucrats, they can just keep justifying their bloated budgets as long as they don't solve anything. The politicians can retain their political power by kind of chasing out productive people who don't want to live in this environment, and of course by importing people dependent on the public taxpayer cash that these politicians claim virtuous credit for shoveling into this bottomless pit. Now, sure, most of this cash, it gets siphoned away by everyone involved in the process. Everyone gets their cut, but some of them do vote and influence elections as well. It's an additional bonus. Now, another little side benefit from this horrible game is just the ability to import large numbers of non-U.S. citizens into the community or drug addicts from other parts of the country. And if you time this just right, you can actually inflate your census data with a bunch of people who both can't legally vote, but also give you the ability to artificially inflate your population numbers in kind of a more concentrated manner so that you can retain political power. Now, sometimes it only takes a small number to tip the political balance in your political favor in your district or to keep the redistricting lines just tight enough to exclude those neighborhoods that they wouldn't vote for you. And this is just another lever, actually, to maintain political power and a side benefit for the political class to just keep trashing their community in this vicious cycle. Now, in truth, unfortunately, political stories like this have been going on for many years now, probably since the 1960s at least. We've actually seen this in Detroit and Baltimore and Philadelphia and other high-profile cities for many years now. That's long before I was born. The political class, they don't care at all how much they basically trash their communities, as long as they retain political power. However, the modern version of these programs, using the homeless industrial complex, shifting the cash distribution into untraceable and then difficult to audit nonprofits, while still bloating the oversight bureaucracy and then doing it in the middle of a drug addiction crisis, this new approach, this really puts an ugly face on an old story. In the past, the political class just couldn't produce enough poor people fast enough or in enough numbers, considering the current birth rates, to ensure political power just long enough to keep going. So the importation now of poor illegals and non-U.S. citizens, this helps keep the gravy train going just a bit longer, and it helps cement political power even more. It is all about math. Now, the left may deny that math is real most of the time, but they will use it when it makes sense for them to retain their power base. So the escalating crime, the overdose deaths, the drug cartels, the attacks on the police, these all help the chaos brewing in a crescendo so that very few are willing to look too closely at how this impacts the distribution of the cash itself into these grants. Now, the part that I believe most people find hard to understand or believe today is that this just isn't an accident. It is an absolutely predictable feature of the current system. It's not a bug of the government programs in place. Nobody can predict every detail or exact scenario that chaotically unfolds, But in kind of a macro sense, you can produce similar results every single time if you provide the incentive or profit potential for perpetuating poverty, like we're doing in so many places around America today. The really ugly part of this is the fact that the political class has made this a key part of their power grab. And sure, it's mostly partisan as well. I mean, these are generally policies and programs that are pushed by the Democrats in every state. Now, some Republicans, of course, are spineless enough to go along as well, but these are generally considered progressive leftist policy outcomes in almost all cases. The bonus of the partisan ownership and affiliation with these grant grifting programs and policies is the simple fact that the media then, they absolutely do their best to cover it up, because the traditional tame media, they exist today mostly to provide cover and political protection to the Democrats and pretty much any of their chosen politicians that the tame media has chosen to support. Now, as billions of dollars get siphoned into the pockets of those who run or manage these nonprofit failures, and then in turn recycle the cash back into the political power for the politicians and bureaucrats to keep the gravy train going, there's actually very little incentive for anyone involved to stop the program. However, there are threats to this ugly cycle of poverty profiteers, and these threats are beginning to scare those who don't want the current system to change. First, you have the escalating inflation. That's actually starting to squeeze the grift and the ability of the taxpayers to even use debt to keep it going. Secondly, the traditional media, they don't have the monopoly that they once did to conceal the truth from the public. It is getting harder to cover up everything that has fallen apart. Finally, an increasingly larger segment of the population is beginning to wake up to just how corrupt, wasteful, and dishonest this whole process has become. And it becomes increasingly difficult to look away. Many still do, of course, but more and more different people every day, they seem to be waking up to the fact that they're being lied to by their government, by the traditional media, and of course by those that they once reflexively trusted. So I want to close this video with some suggestions on what you can do to make a difference where you live. First of all, just start doing your research into all the grants, the budgets, and the cash that is flowing into your local community to solve homelessness or poverty or housing first. You know, it's whatever the cool kids are calling the buzzwords where you live today. Look at the contracts, the budget items, the growth, and then read the reports. Start to find people who have volunteered for these organizations, or better yet, volunteer yourself and find out what is truly happening at the street level. When you have the information on what is happening and the source documents to demonstrate what you've discovered, then you need to find a way to publish this information and share it widely. There is no such thing as too much truth to shine on these local stories, no matter how much the political media wants to cover it up. Every story has the potential to wake up more people, and the more people that we can wake up from their slumber, the better. Now, regardless of whether you look at the homeless industrial complex where you live or the enviro scams your taxpayer dollars are funding where you live, whatever the truth may be, it is worth exposing and revealing for others to know. It is hard to fix a problem unless you expose it. However, you can only do this if you pay attention. You can only do this if you do the research, and you will find it easier to do it when you find others in your community who care as well. So finally, you can only start down this road to make a difference where you live if you're willing to show up. Because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.